You're listening to the podcast Pleasure Equality. It's been difficult for me to pitch the theme of this podcast. Basically, I'd been talking a lot more with my friends about sex. I felt like our conversations were pretty interesting and pretty funny. I thought others might like to hear them as well. And most importantly, I've started reckoning with some huge social problems that I previously willfully ignored, like gender inequality and the patriarchy. So here we are, exploring this via a podcast. My goals right now are to learn to normalize the topic of pleasure during sex, and to try to look at this thing through as many perspectives as possible. With this in mind, I set out to record my first interview. And here it is as episode 1 of Pleasure Equality. This episode is a fly-on-the-wall experience where you'll hear my first guest's take on the topic of female pleasure. She's going by a fake name, Laura.
I remember this is so funny. I remember one time I was on like a girls' holiday with a sports team from my university.
Can I ask what sport?
It was cheerleading.
Awesome.
So it was an all
Okay.
girls team, and we were on holiday in Ibiza. Mm-hmm. So we'd gone there after exams, and I remember we were playing Never However or something, like one of those games that leads to confidences being shared. But we were all girls, so it was very much like sharing everything. And I remember regaling the whole table at one point with my experience of anal sex. And I remember just being like, girls, I'm telling you, it's all about the silicone lube. And like, honestly, I remember all these girls being like, what? Like, seriously, silicone lube? And me being like, yes, don't get glycerin, it's all about silicone. And I woke up the next morning and I was like, oh my God, that's so embarrassing. But actually, like, 5 of them came up to me the next day and they were like, oh, like, that was so great. Like, thanks for telling us about that. Like, you know, like, we've been wanting to try it for a while, but it's never worked. So, like, we're going to give that a go. Da, da, da. And, yeah, I just remember that being like, because I woke up the next morning and I was so embarrassed.
Aww,
but
right.
in the end, it wasn't actually an embarrassing thing to say at all, you know?
Hi, Laura. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Laura, where are you from?
I'm from Scotland. I'm 21 years old. I grew up in a small town in Scotland, and I'm actually here in Budapest now, as you can see.
What was sex education like where you grew up?
Sure. Well, as I said, I grew up in a small Scottish town. I just went to my local state school there. Sex education started when I was about 15, and it really only lasted for that year, from when I was age 15 to age 16.
So there was like no sex education at all prior to around the age of 15?
I suppose there was. Before that it was always just in biology class, so it was really like, boys have penises, girls have vaginas, you know?
But there was some human biology.
Yes.
Like you learned about the reproductive system.
Yeah, it was the reproductive system more than sex in itself. And then when we had sex education, it was about like how to have safe sex and also issues of consent as well. So, you know, I remember listening to a song that was entitled like, My Body's Nobody's Body But Mine. And that was kind of about how, you know, you have a right to say no. But I suppose even then we weren't really taught that much about the effect of alcohol and drugs in issues of consent. And having now done a law degree, and from looking at the kind of morbid, but the rape cases that we read, so many of them were to do with, you know, the girl was really drunk or the boy was really drunk, someone couldn't remember, and was that consent or was that not? And we weren't really taught about that at all. And luckily it never affected me growing up, but especially, you know, as a 15-year-old where you're just starting to drink alcohol and you're just starting to have sexual experiences, I'm sure that other people in my school were more deeply affected by that, and I'm sure there were instances where maybe someone looking at it would have said that someone hadn't consented, but we weren't taught about how we could deal with that.
So I'm curious, what did you talk about with your friends during that time or leading up to that age of 15 or maybe right afterwards?
I mean, with my close friends, none of us had had sex at that point. And I mean, I guess it was all still like pretty mysterious. I mean, what we had done, I remember like me and another one of my close friends had been like fingered by a boy. So we talked about that. But I know categorically that neither of us gained like any particular pleasure from that. It was more of like a stepping stone. It was more of like, oh, like
we think we should do
someone's
this.
touched my vagina, you know? Like it was more of a rite of passage rather than a like meaningful emotional connection that either of us had had with the respective boys that we did it with.
Fingering specifically with
God,
mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think. We talked about boys that we fancied, but never in an overtly sexual way. I think, and I mean that's definitely like changed over time for me with some of my friends, just because you get more sexually active and more confident.
Yeah, what was it like when you after you started having sex and after your friends started? What did the conversation turn into? Like, what were some of the first kinds of conversations?
Gosh, I'm trying to think. I mean, I think originally it was still very much like who's had sex and who hasn't. Like it was like saying you'd had sex. It wasn't even about like what that sex had been like or what that experience of sex had been. It was more like, I've had sex, like she's a virgin, she's not a virgin anymore. Not in an overtly judgmental way. Like I have some friends who are still virgins and I wouldn't, you know, that's completely fine, obviously. But definitely at high school, it was kind of a like,
just have you done it or haven't you?
Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't until probably like at least a year later that we kind of started talking about like what actually felt good whilst having sex.
Yeah, I'm curious because I definitely have noticed like the exact same thing. I would say for me, it's like for a long time the conversation is just about like who's done it.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, it's I feel like it took much longer even for me to be having conversations with my friends about anything more than just that, or like we just assumed everyone was having sex and we weren't really talking about what it was like.
But I think like now that I'm thinking about it, you know, for the first year that when me and my friends were having sex, like I can't really speak for my friends, but I would say for me definitely like the whole experience of even foreplay was like not that clear to me, you know, like kind of like if I was going to have sex with a boy, they'd like touch me a bit and I'd probably touch them a bit, but it took like definitely at least a year after I started having sex for a boy to go down on me. You know, which looking back is quite kind of
a long
time
to be having sex but not experience that type of sex.
Yeah. In terms of volunteering information, I mean, we've talked about this outside of the podcast before, but definitely I find with my female friends once most of our sex talk happens like on a night out once we've had a few drinks and we're kind of like, oh, tell me about this, you know, like everyone, and like we said, it seems like everyone is actually quite keen to talk about it, but we almost need like alcohol to make it socially acceptable.
Yeah, I remember that conversation. It's like 2 drinks in and like we couldn't stop talking about it all of a sudden.
Yeah, completely, which just probably shows that like it needs to be more accepted in sober life, because if we're all just keeping it bottled up until we've had a few drinks, then there's probably stuff that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, and like the type of conversation we were having was just like just talking about things we like and didn't like or funny experiences we've had, like generally really helpful things, I think.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
We should I want to have like a drunk segment where we
we should do that.
Yeah,
we should definitely do that.
Yeah, maybe not like a full-length episode, but we can cut in our like, because I mean I just thought we were being geniuses.
I agree. It'd be great to listen back to it sober and like write down all the tips that we had to share, because I'm sure drunk me is like, like she's a complete genius on sex.
Yeah. Okay, I have another question kind of about this. Has anyone ever Has a friend ever overshared sexual information with you? Like, were you ever like, I wish I hadn't talked to you about this?
Honestly, no. I have never been in a position where I've thought, oh, like, I really wish that I hadn't known that about her. But I think I tend to be a pretty, like, laid-back person in that department. And honestly, in a way, I'm also just curious. Like, I'm just kind of really nosy, so I just want to know what other people have been getting up to in bed, you know? So, yeah, it's always great.
Yeah, we all are.
Yeah.
And, like, to a point where I feel like we are meant to think that's shameful to talk about or be interested in.
I mean, actually, interestingly, like, I've never looked back on a night out or something and gone like, oh, I wish he hadn't told me that. But I've definitely looked back and said, oh, I wish I hadn't said that.
Exactly. I feel the same way. I think that I've said too much, but I never think someone else has told me too much.
Which probably just shows that actually you have hardly ever said too much. Unless you said it to, like, you know,
maybe
maybe someone who is
compromising
implicated.
person.
Exactly. But apart from that, like, yeah, I've never thought, oh, that's too much information. Probably just the opposite, like being like, oh, I wish I'd asked her about that more. Like, oh.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of the few times some of my friends who I've been friends with since long before we were having sex, up until this time that now I think all of us are sexually active. When the few times it has come up and we've gotten into some graphic details about our habits, sexual habits, it's always been like we couldn't stop. Like, it was fascinating, and it was like one secret after the other, and everyone was laughing and enjoying
and like
the
one thing leads to another. You know, like one person will share something about themselves, and then someone else is like, oh my gosh, me too, but I found this, did you find this, you know? And yeah, it's very insightful, actually.
On the topic of the way you discuss it with friends, well, the topic in general, have you ever spoken about any of these things to, like, a male friend? Not necessarily of someone you were sexually interested in, but maybe, well, I want to talk about that later, actually, when you talk about it with actual partners, but I'm curious if you have just a platonic guy friend who you've spoken about this with.
It's interesting you say, actually. At first my mind was blank, but actually, I remember for a while, we're not really such good friends now, but for a while at university, I had a male friend who was bisexual, and we would have, like, very explicit conversations about our sexual likes and dislikes, and he was a great sharer. I mean, he was very good at saying, like, all sorts of very explicit sexual things that he liked to do and that he didn't like to do. So I guess that made me more comfortable in saying what I liked as well. And actually, interestingly, we had some of the same likes. Yeah, so it was just
because
like,
you both did it with dudes?
I guess so, yeah. And we could kind of talk about, like, guys who we fancied, but also, like, you know, he had experience of going down on a girl, so we could talk about, like, what oral sex was like for a girl. Obviously, like, someone going down on me, him going down on someone. And he was actually a really great person to talk with about that kind of stuff, because he was pretty experienced, and obviously he'd been with boys and girls, so he saw things from, like, both sides of the field. And yeah, he just made me feel very kind of empowered, especially in talking about, like, my sexual fantasies more than just, like, what feels good and what doesn't. You know, he was really accepting of anything I said, and was kind of, like, very interested in everything I said, you know, but it was great because it wasn't in a kind of, we never did anything sexual together, so it wasn't in a kind of, like, oh yeah, because we're going to do it together. It's more just like, oh yeah, tell me more, that's interesting, you know, I'll tell you this and then you tell me that, you know. It was a nice dynamic that we had, and it's a shame that we're not in such good contact anymore, actually. Yeah. How about you? Have you had anyone like that?
Yeah, you know, more recently, so I've just to share with everybody, I have just been like I'm really ready to talk about sex with all sorts of people finally, mostly because I've been listening to other podcasts of similar topics, and it's helping me normalize the conversation. That's, like, a big thing I want to do with this podcast, is normalize these topics, and, like, speaking about it with another human being, whether or not you're even having sex with that other person. And so in my, like, excitement of starting to, like, be ready to talk about this, I did kind of, like, heavily dish out to one guy friend recently, and he was, like, perfectly receptive and wonderful about it. And I was so happy to hear it. And he had some funny, interesting things to share of his own. We haven't talked in a long time since well, we've talked since that conversation, but more
but that's the
recently
one
we
that stands
haven't.
out, yeah. Is he someone that you have ever done anything sexual
Well,
with?
actually, yes.
Okay,
But not at the
okay.
time of having that conversation.
Yeah.
And I was thankful to, like, before anything happened with us, just anyways have, like, like an accepting, really, well, to use the word candid again, just such a candid conversation about
Yeah.
experiences with sex.
Yeah, totally. Because I find, like, thinking about it now, I find that all the conversations I've had with boys that have been, like, really, I've looked back and thought that was a really constructive conversation. It was in a setting that was not overtly sexual, even if it was someone that I had done sexual things with in the past or was going to in the future. At that point, we weren't, you know, it wasn't like post-coital, like we weren't in bed together after having had sex, so we weren't like thinking about having sex in the near future.
Yeah.
And I think that probably if it is a guy who that experience is more kind of forthcoming, you know, you are thinking about him in a sexual way, or, you know, he's thinking about you in a very sexual way, I think it's a lot harder to actually have like really honest conversations about sex. Absolutely. In my experience anyway.
I do really want to talk to more heterosexual men about this topic, because I think there's a lot of room for improvement in like this script people have in their heads of how sex should be in heterosexual couplings. And so I want to talk to men who have heterosexual sex as well. So completely. That's on my list.
Yeah, and I think in a way it's true that women's experience of pleasure has probably not been, well, definitely not been given such prominence, you know, for centuries and centuries and centuries, the whole of humanity really. But I think that it's true that we are really good at talking about it when we kind of get together and we're in an all-female group. And I think maybe, like, so you can actually find more of women talking about sex on something like a podcast than you can find men talking about sex on a podcast. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think, like, that's definitely an important angle to look at as well.
Yeah. We should
find some men.
Yeah, absolutely. We should come back to that. Because I need to find some willing candidates to chat about it with.
Yes.
It's because, again, it's like it's about making the conversation comfortable and normal, and it's so unusual to talk about most of these things in my experience with men.
Yeah.
So I want to ask about your sexual partners. Can you describe like how things have changed for you with your how positive your sexual encounters are with male partners?
And how they've changed.
Like how they were at the beginning, how they are now.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely I now expect more from my sexual partners, or I'm almost more kind of critical of my sexual partners. You know, like if I'm with a guy and he's literally making absolutely no effort to, you know, make me, or even not even to make me orgasm, but just to like give me equal attention that I'm giving to him, then it's likely that I won't sleep with him again, kind of a thing. Whereas definitely with my first sexual experiences, first of all, my first sexual experiences were with boys that really one boy that I was at the time believed I was madly in love with. So even though looking back the sex was mediocre in the extreme, I mean, it was, you know, like teenage fumbling, so you can't expect that much, but I never expected him to, you know, give me an orgasm. It just I just didn't really think it would happen. So yeah, I think probably my perspective of like what a guy should be doing in bed has changed over time. But in terms of, I mean, I think definitely the best sex I've had has been with longer term boyfriends, just because you have more time to like explore what makes you work well together, and, you know, you have more time just to kind of build up trust, which is, I think, important in most sexual relationships. But again, I've also had very exciting sexual encounters with just like one night sexual encounters, just because usually of an overwhelming attraction to that person, you know. And I guess that's very much to do with the context, you know. It's just like a one night thing, like I'm attracted to them, and it's kind of taboo and dangerous, and because you know that it is a short-term thing, I think you almost have more agency to be adventurous, and because you know that almost that they're not going to judge you so much, I guess.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense.
No,
So you're kind of more willing to just like do whatever feels right rather than worrying, oh, like if I want a relationship with this guy, what will he think if I ask for this now, you know?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So it's kind of been a bit of a mix, but also definitely I've had disappointing sexual encounters that have been short term and just, you know, have started off because I was attracted to the boy and have just finished with me just being like disappointed in his perception of sex, because it's either like he doesn't care enough about me to try and make me orgasm, or he just doesn't understand how to make a woman orgasm, or even how to try, you know?
Yeah, like there's one, maybe like it's one thing to be like in the ballpark at least with it, with like having your partner come, and another to like not even be on the playing field at all.
Like, I think it's just the effort as well. Like if I think for me as well, oral sex is a big thing for me. Like that is what will make me come most of the time. So if they don't even attempt that, then I'm always a bit disappointed, to be honest. Especially because I'm very happy to go down on a guy. Like I enjoy going down on a guy before having sex with them. So if I do that and they're still like, you know, their head is very much on the pillow.
Yeah, like body language is indicating they're not intending to even
try.
Yeah. Okay, well, I have a couple of questions. So one thing I meant to ask before and completely forgot was I wanted to ask if you usually have orgasms during sex with a male partner.
No. I mean, during penetrative sex, no. Like, not at all. And I think mainly that's because I think that's something I need to explore in myself, because I think I've probably given up trying to even have orgasms through penetrative sex, because I just think the amount of effort involved is so high that it's kind of unfair to expect to avoid for that effort. But definitely during oral sex, I've had like successful orgasms quite a lot. So I guess that's why it's so important to me.
Yeah. Well, if this makes you feel better, based on things I've read and conversations I've had, that is extremely typical.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know if you should like worry about not being able to have penetrative orgasms.
I mean, I think honestly that's an issue at the center of so many debates right now. But I remember having this conversation with one of my ex-boyfriends pretty early on in our relationship. And we had been having sex for about a month, and I hadn't come during sex. And I like pretty obviously hadn't come during sex.
Okay.
And we were talking about it, and he was kind of saying like, oh, but like, why can't you come? You know, like, what am I doing wrong? And I was kind of just being like, oh, well, it's just like, it takes a while, and to be honest, I've had like 2 orgasms through penetrative sex ever, and they've both been what I would describe as flukes. Do you know what I mean?
Like, you don't know why it happened all of a sudden.
So don't feel bad about it. Like, I was really trying to be like, you know, it's just something that is, and I hope it doesn't affect our sex life that much. And he was really, and actually I remember quoting the statistic to him that I'd read, being like, actually only 30% or around 30% of women can come through penetrative sex alone. And he was so adamant that couldn't be correct. He was like, no, I'm sure that can't be right. And eventually I kind of, somehow I found out that his ex-girlfriend apparently, and I mean maybe she had, came really easily all the time, you know?
Yep.
Because of that experience, and he'd been with her for like 3 years, and because of that experience with her, he was convinced that like
that's how all women's bodies worked.
That's how all women's worked. And also that if I didn't come during sex, then like it wasn't good sex for me, and also for him, really. Which I think that's a really problematic attitude as well, because obviously in a way, of course you want a guy to be worried about your orgasm, but you also don't want them to be pressurizing you into feeling like you have to come in order for it to have been like a fulfilling sexual experience for both of you. And I remember that being really disappointing for me, and actually after that I faked orgasms with him quite a lot, which looking back was like a terrible idea.
Twist.
Yeah. A terrible idea and like terrible thing to do, but you know,
how long were you with him?
I was with him for about 9 months. And
like 9 months following that conversation?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I did have real orgasms with him during oral sex, but not during penetrative sex. And sometimes I would fake them just to kind of make him think that it was okay, which is, I mean, I guess that's quite a big revelation for me to share. But, and also that's one of the, you know, and I remember sometimes looking back and thinking maybe his ex had been faking some of her orgasms.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what kind of, do you know what I mean? And then it just becomes a vicious cycle, because the next girl that he's with, if she's one of the 70% of women who can't come through penetrative sex alone, then he's going to have the same conversation. So yeah, that's something that I'm not proud of. And I remember after that relationship promising myself that I was not going to get into that situation again, where I was kind of like faking orgasms regularly just because that was what was expected. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whoa. It's so interesting. I mean, I completely understand that reasoning.
Yeah.
Like, I might have done the exact same thing.
Yeah. But I think it's also kind of like, not immature reasoning, but it's not, looking back, like, that's never a sustainable position to have with someone you want to be in a long-term sexual relationship with, if you want it to be fulfilling.
This is our first episode, listeners, and I'm just double checking that things are still like recording.
Technological things are working.
Do you want to have a water break?
Yes,
okay.
Sure.
Yes, yeah. Okay. All right. So next, I have a question for you about another relevant topic to this podcast, casual sex.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So during a casual sexual encounter, do you sometimes experience a difference between your expectations for pleasure and your partner's expectations?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, generally, I would say during a casual sexual encounter, I would say there's, almost from both of us, there's more of an expectation that the guy will orgasm. Just because, from my experience of sex so far, usually the guy I'm with will orgasm. Not all the time, but like usually. And usually I won't. And I don't know if that's just, I mean, partly I think it's just a physiological thing. Like, it is easier to make a guy orgasm than it is to make me orgasm. And yeah, it's difficult. It is difficult. And I think partly also just, it's almost like if I want someone to make me orgasm, I have to give very specific instructions. And during a casual sexual encounter, I guess I sometimes just feel awkward doing that, you know? And it doesn't mean that it's not pleasurable for me. I know that like girls say this all the time, like, oh, if I don't come, it's still pleasurable. But really, I still enjoy it, you know? I still, especially, you know, usually like I'm obviously attracted to the guy, like we're naked together. It's going to be fun even if I don't come.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, the few times that I have, it has been great and I've, you know, been happy afterwards, but I wouldn't say that it's kind of like integral to my enjoyment of the sex. And just because, yeah, you know, I have to give very specific instructions, and it's almost like sometimes it's almost always when a guy's going down on me, and sometimes I just feel like I'm kind of lying there being like, you know, a little bit to the left, a little bit up, a little bit faster, and if after that it still doesn't happen, it's almost like,
what else can you?
Yeah, you know, it's kind of like not worth all that hassle, which is,
if it's someone you're only going to have sex with once or a few times.
Yeah. And I guess actually I'm just thinking of the settings that I've most recently had sex in. Obviously we live in a hostel. And, you know, bathroom floors, who really wants to be lying on those for a long time?
Right.
But I think also one of the reasons why with casual sexual encounters I probably don't orgasm as much is that one of the things that really helps me to come is using a sex toy. And during a casual sexual encounter, it's unlikely that I'm going to have a vibrator in my handbag ready to whip out. And I guess I also, in my head, I'm like, oh, if I did that, would the guy be really intimidated, you know?
Have you ever like got out a sex toy too soon in a relationship?
No, I don't think I have actually. I've only used sex toys in one relationship that I've been in, so my experience of it isn't that wide. And that was like quite a few months in, and actually it was the boy encouraging me to use a sex toy. So that was like actually a really great thing that he was like willing to explore that side of things. Because sometimes I think that there's still kind of a stigma about having sex and using a vibrator at the same time, because it somehow suggests that the boy like isn't able to pleasure you by himself, you know. But from my perspective, like if a guy is keen for me to use a vibrator, that is, you know, an absolute good thing, and I would never be like, oh, that means he's inferior in bed. Like that means he's great in bed from my perspective. If he's like willing to explore that and he's open to those kind of things, then, you know, it's, as we said, like it's about communication and being comfortable and saying what feels good to you and what doesn't.
I had sorry to interrupt. I had an observation when you mentioned positions and bathroom floor, etc. I've been thinking lately about how we have these ideas, these common ideas from like movies and things, and I don't watch very much porn yet. I think I need to start watching porn though to educate, see what the masses are learning.
Indeed, yeah.
Excuse me, but I think from like mainstream media and everything, we have these ideas that like adventurous sex should like, which is okay, good sex is sometimes equated with adventurous sex, but it doesn't have to be.
Oh, completely.
And you don't have to have crazy sex positions, and often for female anatomy there's not very many weird positions you can do and also have an orgasm.
No,
like,
I mean,
it's such a weird thing that we have in our heads.
Like, there's because on the one hand you get all these movies, you know, and there's a sex scene where, God, they've been just dying to get each other for ages, and then they're in some room somewhere, and it's almost always, I find, the ones that really annoy me are the ones where they have sex up against a wall, and, you know, like 3 minutes in, she's like gasping with pleasure, right? And like 2 minutes after that, they both happily come at the same time, and like it's all good. I mean, that's just not a realistic perception of sex. Like, he hasn't even touched her clitoris for more than like,
they never touched the clitoris in movies.
Exactly. Yeah, but I mean, obviously adventurous sex can be fun in a kind of like, ooh, like we're in a bathroom and there's someone outside. But in terms of like actual, you know, as we said, expectations of pleasure, if we both want to orgasm, then I think it needs to be for me it needs to be a much calmer setting. We probably need to be in a bed. There needs to be lots of time. You know, maybe like a break for snacks.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think also the other side of that is, you know, from another movie industry, porn, I think a lot of positions that are really kind of like, oh, if we have sex in the crazy position we can, then it's good sex. A lot of those are actually just positions made up so that the camera can be like right on the action.
Of course, I never thought about that.
Yeah, like I think I've read an article about how loads of the positions that are kind of, you know, the man and woman aren't actually, there's not even that much skin contact between the guy and the girl. It's just like the two ends are touching and then everything else is like going backwards from that, just so that the camera can see penis going in vagina, which is meant to be like the most kind of stimulating thing to see, especially for male viewers, the article said. So I think actually for me, if I'm like not hardly touching the guy, then it's more of a turn off, you know, because it just feels much more impersonal and much more like being used as a sex object rather than having sex.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I didn't mean to like, I think fun, weird position sex has its place and is really fun too.
Yeah.
But it comes back to expectations for pleasure. Like, if I'm just expecting to kind of have fun and I don't even want to say fool around, have fun and maybe actually have sex too, it's maybe the weird position is fun and that meets my expectations for the encounter.
Yeah. I think it's all about context and just like, you know, just being with someone that you just, you know, that you do trust, even if it's just a casual hookup.
I just got an alert on my phone.
I've
Storage almost full. You guys, we filled my phone with the first podcast. Well, this has been a great first episode. I'm so excited. Thank you, Laura. All right, well, we'll have to say goodbye for now, but not forever.
Okay. Goodbye, listeners.
The music in this episode is by Will Brown. Information for how to find more of his music is included in the description of this episode. Subscribe and check back for more content.
If you have any questions or comments, or if you'd like to speak on the podcast, email me at goodnotjustfine@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.
Let me hear you say. Let me hear you say. Let me hear you say.